Alright folks, we are going to try to do the world's fastest review of ecology concepts. This is going to be the first of 3 podcasts dealing with this, so I'm going to try to be quick. Here we go. Getting started. Make sure you know these basic vocabulary terms. You need to know that level of organization thing from organism up through biosphere. You should know what all those terms mean. Go back and learn them if you don't. You need to know what biotic and abiotic refer to, the living and non-living components of an ecosystem. Habitat, you should know. Niche, the role of an organism. Autotroph and heterotroph, you should know. And this one we haven't talked about a whole lot, but the difference between photoautotrophism versus chemoautotrophism. It used to be thought that basically the sun-based food web was all that existed on planet Earth. All life was fueled ultimately by the sun. All food webs were. Until in the 1970s, Bob Ballard, who's the same guy that found the Titanic and all that, in the 70s, he discovered these deep sea vents that had entire communities, ecosystems of life around them, but there was no sunlight. And what the organisms were doing was something called chemosynthesis as opposed to photosynthesis. In chemosynthesis, the organisms were taking inorganic compounds coming out of these vents and turning them into organic compounds. The bacteria were doing it, and the entire webs of life would come up around feeding on these bacteria, the bacteria playing the role of the producers, or the plants, as we would know them up here. So you need to know that. There's a video at the end of this podcast that I would like you to watch. Hopefully it'll fire right up as soon as you're done with this. If not, if you'll click on it from the YouTube channel. Okay? You need to know this topic very well. You need to know how nutrients and energy move through an ecosystem. Nutrients are the little building blocks, the atoms, the molecules that build your body, that build plant bodies, that build the bodies of all living things. And you need to think of the atoms and molecules as simply very, very tiny Legos. And we can take these Legos and build up and make a squirrel, and then we can break them all apart and make a bird, and then we can break them all apart and make a flower, and then we can break those apart and make a tree, and so on. We reuse these same components over and over and over again, okay? The term biogeochemical cycles is a scary way of just saying a nutrient cycle. So do not, please don't let this word scare you. Bio is just meaning that these nutrients will sometimes be in living things, biological things. Geo means sometimes these nutrients are in an abiotic thing, like the earth itself or the atmosphere, and they cycle between these two components over and over again. You need to know these specific nutrient or biogeochemical cycles. You need to know the carbon, the nitrogen, the water, and the phosphorus cycle, and we'll hit those very quickly. You also need to know that energy flows. It does not cycle, meaning we cannot reuse energy over and over. That's the problem with energy. Once you use it, it is gone, or maybe not gone, but it is simply not usable to us. So energy is less concrete. It is the ability to do work. It is not stuff. It is not molecules. It is the ability to do something with molecules, okay? And it passes through the ecosystem and then it's gone, or at least not very usable. It is usually, its final state for us is in the form of heat, and that's just not terribly usable to a living thing. So this is from the original PowerPoint that you viewed. Energy flows through an ecosystem, whereas nutrients stay here and cycle. Energy is going to be leaving planet Earth eventually in the form of heat, whereas nutrients will stay here and cycle over and over and over again. The atoms in your body right now once were in other living things, okay, a long time ago. All right, and you need to know the nutrient cycles, the carbon cycle, in which you will have your inorganic source of carbon. Our plants take it in for us, and then once we have eaten the plants, or the raccoon has eaten the plants, or whatever, the carbon that was in the plants is sent back into the atmosphere through respiration, okay? fossil fuel burning can also put this carbon, and does put this carbon in huge quantities to the severe detriment of our ecosystems and our planet back into the atmosphere. Okay, and that's just a little summary. You need to be aware of this cycle. Nitrogen cycle is much more complex. Atmospheric nitrogen in the atmosphere. 78% of the molecules in the air you are taking into your lungs right now are nitrogen molecules, N2. Your body desperately needs nitrogen for use in building DNA molecules, for use in building proteins, and you are swimming in nitrogen, 78% of the atmosphere, but you cannot use it in this form, and neither can these plants shown in this little picture. All this grass can't use it that way either, and the plants need it just as much as we do. So how do we get it? Okay, we rely heavily on organisms that can use that atmospheric nitrogen, and these are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria that exist oftentimes symbiotically, mutualistically with plant roots. There's the little pockets or nodules of bacteria colonies there living in concert with these plant roots. They're also found in the soil, also in aquatic ecosystems. Plankton have a relationship with these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These bacteria take this unusable N2 and convert it to an usable form that we think of as ammonia. And then plants can take that up. Plants can take that up. Okay. Now, how do we get it? Well, we get it by eating the plants, but how do we get it back into the cycle? How do we make a cycle out of it? Well, the herbivores eat the plants, carnivores eat the herbivores, whatever, but ultimately these critters are going to die or leave waste. This waste is decomposed by bacteria, okay, and there are bacteria that return this waste to the form that's in the DNA and the proteins, to the form of ammonia again, or to a form, ultimately, nitrifying bacteria will take that and often convert it into something called nitrates. Either way, these two forms are usable once again by the plants. So the plants could take up these forms from the soil, or something called a denitrifying bacteria can take this stuff here and actually just reboot the whole thing, send it back up into the atmosphere as regular old nitrogen gas, and then the cycle would repeat entirely over again. You need to have a grip on this nitrogen cycle, and most importantly for you is the role of those nitrogen-fixing bacteria, without which no organisms that we are familiar with could be able to use nitrogen, which we desperately need. Okay? All right. Get past this stuff and to the phosphorus cycle that is pretty straightforward. Phosphorus is locked up in rocks. It becomes soil from weathering, and so soluble in the soil from weathering, and may go into solution or whatever, and the plants will take it up from the soil. It will be then consumed by animals, who will then leave waste, and the decomposers will return it back to the soil. So this is not a difficult cycle. It's essentially in the rocks. It gets taken up by the plants, it gets consumed by the animals, returned to the soil, taken up by the plants, and so on. I wouldn't sweat this one too much. It's pretty straightforward. Water cycle, you should know. Water is existing in bodies of water. It evaporates. It also transpires. I do want to start getting you acquainted with this term. We'll learn more about it later, but transpiration is when plants take up water through their roots, as all plants do, and it exits through their leaf surfaces into the atmosphere. That's transpiration. It's really quite an important part of how water gets into the atmosphere, not just evaporation. Then the water will condense and rain back down, and when it does so, run off or percolate down into the groundwater or run off into the oceans, and so we can again, keep the cycle going. Slide on transpiration, just don't want you to forget this. This is going to be a really important concept, and it's not trivial in ecology at all. Nutrients as limiting factors. Nutrients. How productive can an ecosystem be? It depends on how productive the producers are. How productive they are depends on how well they can do photosynthesis, which means, do they have sunlight? Usually that's in plentiful supply. So then it falls, well, do they have all the nutrients they need? Do they have the nitrogen to build DNA and protein? Do they have the phosphorus to build ATP and proteins and things like that, DNA? Do they have the nutrients they need? If they don't have enough, or they have enough but not too much, that will keep the populations of producers in check. If there is too much of a nutrient, well, can you have too much of a nutrient? Can you have too much of something that's good and makes you grow? Well, the answer is yes. If you are trying to at least maintain a balanced ecosystem. This pond is showing what happens when you have too much of a nutrient. Usually that nutrient is either nitrogen or phosphorus. It could be something else, but these are the things that are usually in limited supply. And when they are unlimited, the algae and so on in the system will begin to grow out of control. What happens when they do that? Well, they themselves don't kill the fish, but when those algae begin to die, they get decomposed by bacteria. Bacteria doing this decomposition suck all the oxygen out of the water. And then that leads to massive die-offs of animal life in the water. That's really called a dead zone or a hypoxic zone, and it is caused, and you do need to know this word, eutrophication. And what that means is what we just talked about, when the animal life dies because too much algae was growing and it began to decompose. That decomposition sucks the oxygen out of the water. So caused by excess nutrients. You need to know that. And you also should be aware that this is a dead zone that occurs every year in the Chesapeake Bay. Some years it's worse, some years it's better than this, but that shows where there is not enough oxygen to support life. You should understand this, the role that deforestation might play in the health of a body of water. And you think, well, the trees are on the land, how does that affect the body of water? Because if you chop down the trees and deforest an area, all of a sudden the roots that were once there taking up all that nitrogen and protecting the and retaining it in soil are gone, and so all the nitrogen, phosphorus, whatever, now the runoff level, the amounts of that in the runoff going down to a nearby creek or pond escalate dramatically. And what you're seeing here is that the concentration of nitrate in a nearby body of water or in the runoff was much, much higher after deforestation had occurred. You should be able to understand a graph like that. You need to understand energy pyramids and how energy, we are now shifting over to talking about how energy goes through an ecosystem. You need to be able to understand producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, on up to maybe tertiary or quaternary consumers, but you won't go much higher than that, and we'll talk about why. You need to understand this diagram. You need to understand about food chains, and again, this is just a little bit different from talking about the trophic levels there. We're trying to kind of plug in specific producers, consumers. There's a grass, there's a grasshopper, there's a rodent, rat, whatever, and a hawk. And you need to understand that this level feeds, the level below feeds the level above. You also need to know that decomposers would be at every level. If any one of these organisms dies or leaves waste, bacteria, decomposers, bacteria, fungi, whatever, will be there to recycle those nutrients. But the sun is what is fueling this entire food chain, because it is fueling these producers down here. If the sun's not there, the producers won't be there, the consumers won't be there, and so on. Now, we need to talk about why it is that, I'm going to skip ahead to this slide that you really need. why is it that if we're looking at an energy pyramid, here's all the energy that strikes the producers from the sunlight, 1,000,000 joules, 1,000,000 calories, whatever. It's an amount of energy, it's a lot. Okay? And the primary producers, let's say they take all of that in. Of course, maybe they won't. They're not perfect. But only about 10% of this large quantity of energy that came from the sunlight gets passed to the grasshoppers at the next level. And only 10% of that gets passed to the next level, to the secondary consumers. And only 10% of that gets passed to the next level. So why can't energy pyramids be unlimited? Because none of these organisms passes on all the energy that they possessed at one point to the next level. They only pass 10%. And so eventually you just have a finite limit of how many organisms that ecosystem can support. Okay, so that's showing you an energy pyramid. Now what I want to go back to is talking about why. Why is that pyramid getting smaller? Well, because not all of the energy that this plant ever was exposed to, ever got exposed to in its life, is getting passed to this beetle that eats it. Only the part that is in its actual tissues is getting passed to that beetle. The rest of it was lost by the plant to its own activities, to its own growth, to its own phototropism, to its own seed production, whatever. It was lost. And all that this beetle can get is whatever is left in this tissue. And then when this beetle is eaten, all that the organism, the bird that eats him, is going to get is whatever is in his tissues. Whatever the beetle used to crawl around, to make babies, to eat, whatever energy it used is gone. Cellular respiration, feces, whatever, it's gone. So only 10% of that energy actually gets passed up. The rest of it is lost from the food chain. Okay, let me get out of this. Okay. Don't forget there's pyramids of biomass and pyramids of numbers where you can either weigh the organisms in an ecosystem and you get a very similar picture by weight. By mass, there's way more producers than there are consumers. Pyramid of numbers, by sheer number. If you count all the grass plants, there's way more of them than there are the consumers above them. Okay? You need to know what a food web is and the complexity of those. You need to know about biological magnification. That is a type of pollution that is kind of becomes more severe in the top predators because of this food web scenario. DDT was the classic example. Okay, very low concentrations, but it does not degrade in tissues. So because it does not degrade in tissues, then if these plankton take in some of that from the water, then it's in their tissues forever, and it builds up every time they take some in. These minnows that are eating the plankton, it never leaves their tissues. So the more plankton they eat, the more it's going to build up, and so on until you get to this top predator, and it's actually at a very high concentration in their tissues. Okay? The effects of DDT were that the eggs of these ospreys were weakened and they crushed them when they sat on them. Populations of birds were decimated. But once DDT was gotten out of the ecosystem, the problems subsided. And bald eagles and others are coming back marvelously. So that's it. We'll stop here, and part 2 will come up. Please don't forget to watch the little additional video on chemoautotrophs, chemosynthesis at the deep sea vents. All right, thanks a lot. I'll see you at the next podcast.